Okay, so that's recording. They'll cut whatever needs cutting. Just making sure it's fine. But it should be. Well, I'm delighted, Rae, to have you here. You're a wonderful poet. You are one of the founding members of the West Coast Group of Language Poets, and you stand apart from other language poets because of your specific voice and your commitment to the interior, the domestic, and I want to say the inner life. You were born in Vallejo, California, and earned your BA at the University of California, Berkeley, where you studied with Denise Leverkov. That is great. I wish I could have done that. And you earned your MA from San Francisco State University. You were a professor of poetry and poetics at UC San Diego the first time I met you. And you're currently a judge of the Yale Younger Poet Prize. I'm not going to say much more, except for the fact that I want to thank you, Rae Armantrout, for being a guest of ours, and perhaps ask you basic question, which is how, not so much how you became a poet, but how you became aware that you were a poet, and what made you write, if it can be said in a few words.
Well, I'm not sure it can be said in a few words. Thank you, Hélène, by the way. My mother read poetry to me when I was very young, and I think I was especially receptive to the rhythms of it. And maybe just the fact that she was reading, there would be picture books with children's poetry, but it wasn't the kind of children's poetry that you get today. In fact, actually, there was a small Emily Dickinson poem in there. And there was actually Ariel's song from Shakespeare, extracted from the play and somehow called children's poetry. And she'd gotten a hold of this encyclopedia, it was called, of children's poetry, and would read it to me, and I just was very excited about that even before I went to school. But of course, I didn't know that I was a poet, or that, I just enjoyed that, the sound of the language and the kind of magic it seemed to have. When I got to school, I had a teacher, I think it was in first grade, who also liked poetry, which was very good luck. And she had us write little poems that she was going to put in a mimeographed book. And I wrote a poem that was about fish. It was like, I don't know how I got this in my head, or it sounds like a haiku, and I'm not sure I'd ever seen a haiku. Maybe she showed us haikus. That's the only rational explanation. But I wrote something that went like, the little fish swim around and around and away. And, she liked it too. And so that was in this booklet. And because I was getting positive attention for it, it was something that at least for a while I wanted to keep doing. Also, it was something I could do when I was by myself. And I was an only child. And my mother worked, which was, I was a child in the 1950s, so it was somewhat unusual that my mother worked. And my father was in the Navy, and he was gone for long periods of time, and he didn't take any part in childcare anyway. My grandmother, my mother's mother, lived with us, and she was, kind of took care of general needs, but she was not much of a companion. So I was really alone a lot. And I discovered that reading and also just writing down my ideas was a great way to pass the time. And sometimes they might be I might write down things I thought were poems, and sometimes it might be something else, but I just found that writing was a way to preserve my thoughts, which is what writing is, in fact. And I suppose I was a little bit upset with how ephemeral thoughts were, and even at a young age, and so I wanted to get them on a page. Now, when I was 12, I had a teacher. Yeah, I was starting 7th grade. I had a teacher who could see how much I liked poetry, and she gave me a seminal modernist anthology edited by Louis Untermeyer. And it had a lot of poets in it that that you don't hear of today, or that you don't hear much of, like Sarah Teasdale, say, Edna St. Vincent Millay, etc. But it also had, sorry, I have to take a sip sometimes. It also had Ezra Pound and H.D. and T.S. Eliot, all of the important modernists. And that kind of blew my mind. And so even then, I liked that. When I got to high school, I started to be self-conscious about writing poetry or even reading poetry. And if I was in the library or something, I wasn't a very popular kid anyway, so I would probably be sitting alone, and I didn't want there to be any reason for people to be hostile or ridicule me. So I would pile textbooks up around my page and write poetry so that no one could see it. But none of that answers the question of when I knew I was a poet. It was more just something I always did. I might have known I was a poet if I knew that, there were contemporary poets. I don't think I even really realized that. All the poets that I had read were dead. And I lived in sort of the outskirts, suburban San Diego, and San Diego, which it's not a small city, but neither is it a cultural hub. I mean, that's changing a bit now with a big university there, and but anyway, at the time, it was a bit of a cultural backwater, so I didn't really have any idea what might be going on. I started to get an idea, though, because my high school, I went to a public high school. My high school history teacher really didn't want to teach, which was probably a good thing in a way, because he had all these magazines. And he'd just say, there's stacks of magazines, go read some magazines. And among them, I think, were the New Yorker and, various magazines. Even Time was a revelation. I could find out all kinds of things. By that time I was about 1965 maybe, and so I found out about LSD and hippies and also Allen Ginsberg and feminism and or the beginnings of it, Betty Friedan. So, I could go off on a tangent then about those other aspects like feminism, but I guess I shouldn't. So I started using the local public library and seeing what I could find in the way of poetry, which was a little. And I started college at a college near my house, San Diego State. And by that time, I even took a workshop with a guy named Glover Davis, who never really made much of an impact on the world. But he was a student of Philip Levine, so that was sort of his orientation. We didn't bond especially, but I made some friends who liked poetry. And I started to buy anthologies at the bookstore. which was a good bookstore back then in the way that college bookstores in the United States no longer are. So I started to buy anthologies and to have a wider, that's where I discovered Denise Levertov, sense of. And then that's one reason that I decided to transfer to Berkeley. It's because I knew that she was there. And there were other reasons too. You know, it was the cultural mecca for students who felt like they were on the left at that time. So anyway, I ended up there. And when I was at Berkeley, not only did I meet Denise Levertov, but I also met my lifelong friend Ron Silliman, another one of the language poets. And he was much more kind of advanced in, because he'd grown up in Berkeley, I think, in what he knew and what he was aware of in terms of contemporary poetry. And so he gave me a kind of more really schooling, I think, than Denise did. She, I guess the main thing that she imparted to her students was to be very aware of line break and to not take it for granted, which is important. And she also got me reading Robert Creeley. And, but, you know, Ron had a whole, like, syllabus of things I should be reading. And from there, I was able to make connections with other poets in the Bay Area. So by the time I was at Berkeley, I pretty much had an idea that that's what I wanted to do. I mean, the idea that that was in any way practical or likely to succeed was far from my mind. Because, you know, I just wasn't from that kind of background, and I don't know, maybe that helped me in a way, being from nowhere, you know. The people I know who grew up, let's say in New York, in intellectual families, felt a huge sense of, well, someone said belatedness yesterday, of the cultural tradition weighing down on them, and I don't think I did, being a Westerner and, you know, on the West Coast. And I think I had the sense that, you know, you can just do what you want. So anyway, I managed to graduate from Berkeley having prepared in no way for any practical career, and I went back to my parents' house, like kids do now. But I didn't stay there long because I knew Chuck, my husband, from our days at San Diego State, and so we hooked up again, and we got an apartment, and about a year after that, we got married, and then about a year after that, we moved together to San Francisco because I applied to and got into San Francisco State's MA program. It was about to become an MFA program, but I majored in creative writing there. And by that time, I had the idea that there might be jobs in creative writing, but, you know, that too was an illusion, at least at that time. But still, once I was in the city, the only thing that mattered really to me then was the people I was meeting, and it was very exciting. I mean, I met Robert Grenier and Barrett Watton, and then Lynn Haginian, and Carla Harriman, and Steve Benson, and Bob Roman, and, you know, the list goes on. And that was one poetry scene, but it wasn't the only poetry scene. There were others of groups of young poets, and everyone had, not everyone, I didn't, but some people had magazines, some people ran reading series. For a while, our group was running a reading series at the Grand Piano Coffee House, and I was in charge of it even for a while. I say even because I didn't tend to step to the fore and take responsibility. But in that case, I was persuaded to do it, and it was a good thing. It was really fun. And so there was a reading, there were like 3-4 readings a week, not at that particular venue, but if you wanted to go to Intersection, for instance, or... mostly this was not at universities, although they had readings too, but this was just kind of DIY, do-it-yourself, young people doing things. And so the question is, do you take yourself seriously? And we absolutely did. It was kind of like the way Jack Spicer who was also a San Franciscan of a generation earlier, didn't even want his poems published he said, outside of the Bay Area. Well, we weren't quite like that, but we made no efforts to try to publish outside the Bay Area, and we didn't. I mean, this might have been crazy, I don't know, but we apparently not. We just did our own thing right there, and then eventually we connected with other language poets who had been coming along in New York, Charles Bernstein and Bruce Andrews specifically. And so then we had a New York connection, and gradually I met other people who were in the New York area, Susan Howe, Maureen Owen. And so it all became, being a poet by that time, seemed very real, but I just kind of walked into it almost blindly, step by step, but just by following what I loved and what I wanted to do, not by having a desire for that as my goal, or for knowing that that's what I was, but just knowing that I didn't want to do anything else, which sometimes is, the only other thing that I could have done, the practical, I could have tried to be a high school teacher. I could have gone for a PhD somewhere. That would have been the normal course, I guess. I could have applied to law school. But I figured that any of those other things would have stopped the excitement of the poetry, and I just didn't want to do that. So.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. I think we have to stop here. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you for this thrilling account of your trajectory. We will soon go to the library for a reading of your poems, so whoever has listened to this and been thrilled by your account can also watch the reading. Thank you so much, Rae.
Thank you, Hélène.